Hello and welcome back to my channel, and more importantly, part 4 of my series, Living with a Tao Tao. In my last video, I asked you guys if you wanted access to my health report data, and to my surprise, you said yes. But I'm going to do you one better. I'm going to make my entire Tao Tao log available to you, and I'll be answering some of your most asked questions. So let's get started. As I expanded the data I was keeping track of, I started to realize the limitations of my little log here. I realized if I threw it all in a Google Doc, I could have rolling totals for cost of service and even calculators for things like fuel mileage. I then realized I could share the entire document with you, and you could see my little experiment unfold in real time. Alright, so here it is, my digital Tao Tao log. This section of the log is where it all began, the trip log. And the setup is pretty basic. I have a date here. I have my odometer in, my odometer out. Of course, that's reading in kilometers, but just so no one gets confused. And I have trip notes. Now, in the trip notes, I have anything that happened to me on that trip, whether the scooter apped it up, or if everything was great, or what kind of trip it was. And I also like to list where I was going because it kind of gives me an idea of how I'm driving or where I'm driving. So I know here, Home Depot, I know where the Home Depot is, I know what the route is. If I was to have some sort of catastrophic failure here, I would know, well, what was the last trip I took? Oh, it was Home Depot. It was a long straight run, and I had a weed eater on the back of it. So this is kind of interesting. I've started to color code the months. This is everywhere I went in the month of June, and then July has this other color. And here's where I am now. And I kind of appreciate the fact that it reads a little like a journal. I can see where I was and how long I'd been riding the scooter on what day. All right, let's get into the next tab here, which is the service history. A little more technical, but pretty easy to read. It starts with the date and the odometer, of course. Service performed is if the service is actually named in the owner's manual. So like first assembly is named, 300 kilometer is a named service in the manual, 1,000 kilometer, and the next one will be a 2,000 kilometer service. Next to that, we're going to have the description of what I performed in that service. So here's my assembly and PDI, my oil change, my final drive, installed new spark plug. You'll notice here, I have a date but no service performed. That's because these repairs were done outside of the normal service schedule. So kind of interesting to keep track of. And spoiler alert, I did adjust the carburetor and adjust the steering bearings again on 7.6. Next, I have the parts listed, any parts that I used to perform the services. So the oil change, I used Bel-Ray EXL 10W40. It's a 1 liter bottle. And here's the actual cost of the part. So I don't want to bill $8.90 for every single oil change because I don't use the full liter, So I've actually prorated the parts cost out here. So because I use 700 cc's of a 1 liter, I actually only use $6.23 worth of oil. I kind of think that's kind of fun to keep track of. Now the parts costs are totaled over here in this little window. And that is so that you can keep track of how much it is to service the scooter if you're just buying parts and not paying for labor. And we move right over here to the labor tracker. So this is what a shop would bill you for these services. For first assembly and PDI, they'll probably bill you 1.5 hours. Your shop rate may vary. This is about what we charge to assemble and uncrate a scooter at the last shop I was working at. Here's the 300K service. So if I was going to change the oil and do a valve adjustment, I charge an hour. We have the hour labor rate here. So that would be $165 because it's 1.5 hours at $110 per hour. $110 an hour is about the average rate for a motorcycle shop here in Austin, Texas. And it was the labor rate at the last shop I was at. And the labor cost is getting totaled over here. So if you just want to know how much the labor is to keep track of this scooter at this point, it's totaled over here. And of course, we've got then parts and service together added for a total current service cost. So this is, if you had all of this performed by a shop, this is what they would bill you for parts and labor. Last column here is the notes. So I want to keep track of things that I find are interesting. Like here, the exhaust valve was set with 0 lash. There was an off-brand spark plug I replaced with an NGK. I had to tighten the steering head bearings here at the 300 kilometer service, 1,000 kilometer service. Here's the things that I found. And I just want to keep track of that so I can see what kind of things are happening if we have any reoccurring problems. All right, moving right along to my favorite tab, which is fuel economy. Now this sheet keeps track of the fuel usage for my scooter, and I fill this out every time I purchase gas for the Tao Tao. So I say the date that I filled up, the odometer reading when I was filling the tank, and of course that's in kilometers. So I have next to it a mile conversion. That's going to be important for converting to miles per gallon. And I list how much fuel it takes to fill the tank. Now I'm filling the tank to the same spot every time, which is just at the base of the filler neck, and trying to be consistent with that. Then I list the cost of the fuel, because I think that's kind of interesting. That really is a big savings over here. I've been driving this thing for over a month and it's cost me $14 in gas. Pretty neat. Then I calculate the miles traveled on that tank of fuel. So basically I'm subtracting the opening number from the odometer from the closing number and listing it over here. I'm then dividing this number by the number of gallons it took, and that gives me my miles per gallon reading. What's cool about having this all together is I can see, hey, this was a low miles per gallon reading, relatively speaking. So I can go back to the date. Okay, 6/22. So between 6/17 and 6/22, what kind of trips was I taking? Okay, here's 6/17. Oh, yeah, down here, we had a long hill at 25 miles per hour. Maybe that was affecting my fuel economy. Just kind of neat to have it all together. And last but not least, we have my scooter's health report. Now, this is the inspiration to sharing this whole document with you guys. I'm sure you're familiar with it by now, but just wanted to go through the parameters I'll be monitoring for my health report. I have, again, the date and the kilometer. I've done a compression reading at 442 miles. I ended up doing that a little bit later. Remember, I waited a few days after I performed my 300 kilometer service. Well, now you know exactly how long it took me to get that done. Spoiler alert again. So here's my compression reading in PSI. I then have my stator outputs, at idle and at 5,000 RPM on both stator windings. I have my charge coil output at cranking, my total charging system voltage. I'm keeping track of that again because it's interesting that it's 12.6 here and 12.5 here, but both of them are 0.2 of a volt less than the standing voltage of the battery. And we go on here to the pickup coil resistance, which is in ohms, my pickup coil output and AC voltage. And we keep going out, and the last thing I'm keeping track of is my tire tread depth. So I'll be including a link to this document in this video's description and in every Tao Tao video before and hereafter. So you can play along at home, check in whenever you want, or see this data for yourself while watching the video. So let's get down to your questions or things I feel I need to clarify. The first, and probably the biggest one, is ye olde carburetor debate. Now, the general consensus in the comment section is that I should leave it stock and do the best I can with just adjusting the stock carburetor as it was delivered. Now, if the adjustments don't bring this thing to a healthy and safe performance level, I think I have enough of your permission to reject it. But to consider everyone's comments, I'm going to try to just adjust it first. Now, the next most common topic brought up in the comment section is the debate whether to mod or not to mod. Now, you guys have suggested things from de-restricting the airbox to throwing a different carburetor on it or changing my belt and transmission setup. And I want to just throw something out there. Right now, I'm still braking in this engine. I am not officially done braking it in until 3,000 kilometers. And because it's telling me to keep the speed low, I assume that means it's saying don't use full throttle, don't get as much out of this engine as you can until it's all the way broken in. So if I did throw a bigger carburetor on it or de-restricted the airbox, what's going to happen is it's going to burn more fuel, produce more power, and I don't think that I'm going to be appropriately following the break-in service. So At this point, I am not going to mod it until at least 3,000 miles, unless I have a failure. Now, I have always said that a mechanical failure is just an opportunity to improve your scooter. Like, if you wear out your piston rings and your cylinder is all hammered, it's a perfect opportunity to throw on a big bore kit. Same thing, if your CDI bites the dust, well, replace it with a nicer one with a tunable ignition curve. So, until 3,000 miles, I am not going to mod anything. And after that, I probably won't mod until something breaks. Unless I can't take this 32-mile-an-hour life anymore. The next most common question I get in the comments is, what kind of fuel mileage am I getting out of this little thing? And I'm happy to report the fuel mileage is pretty darn good for this scooter as it sits here. Now, part of the great fuel mileage I'm getting is due to the extremely lean running carburetor. It's just literally not allowing enough fuel to run out of the tank into the engine. But the lowest fuel mileage I've gotten is 108 miles per gallon, and the highest I've gotten is 112 miles per gallon, which is pretty great for a carbureted engine. Now, the next most common question is one I get from innocent bystanders as well as YouTube scooter commenters, and that is, what is the top speed of this scooter? Now, I have to bring this back around, but I am breaking this engine in, and it says do not exceed speeds greater than 37 miles per hour. And that's also kind of a contentious point, right? Because in a normal motorcycle, it says don't exceed this speed in this gear. And that's to try and keep the RPMs in a certain range and to try and keep you from going full throttle while the engine is still breaking in. Now, the variable transmission on this kind of nullifies that whole concept, because even if you're going 18 miles an hour, this thing is still revving up to 8,000–9,000 RPM. So it's more about break-in under engine load is what I'm kind of interpreting it as. So I have not taken this thing at full throttle yet, and that's also why I haven't done 0 to 30 runs with a GPS, is because I'm not really going to be able to consistently do that until I can go full throttle. So I've been keeping this thing at like 1/2 to 3/4 throttle on my way to work, and if I get on like just a medium incline, and I'm only limited to 3/4 throttle, this thing slows right down to like 20 miles an hour. But on a flat surface, if I have no wind or a tailwind, it'll get up to 35 miles an hour indicated. I have accidentally exceeded 37 miles an hour. I was going down a very, very steep hill with like almost no engine load. So I think it's okay. The RPMs weren't that high. But I'm gonna say when this thing is fully broken in, the top speed's probably gonna be around 40 if you have a long, long stretch of level ground and no wind at all. Now, I've gotten some pretty cool suggestions for data to keep track of while I'm performing this experiment. And the first one comes from Dylan Chubbs, and he says he wants to know how I feel about this scooter. And I think that's actually a pretty interesting thing to keep track of, because there is that honeymoon period where you're just excited to have a new bike, and it kind of has ups and downs, and I really should be keeping track of that. And I can be reporting to you how I feel about the scooter. So look forward to my 1,000 mile review of this scooter. I'm gonna go in depth on all the emotional roller coaster this thing has caused for me. And the next bit of data I got that I thought would be really interesting to keep track of is from a user named Jess Bonner. And Jess suggested I keep track of the suspension droop on this vehicle. Now, suspension droop is basically an indicator of how worn out your suspension components are. The bike will ride lower and lower and lower the more that you ride it, because the springs get worn out from bouncing up and down. I think the suspension is like the biggest complaint I have about this scooter. I can deal with a 50cc engine, I can deal with a small chassis, I can deal that it's kind of an ugly bike. But the suspension is just awful. So I'm going to develop a really consistent way to measure my suspension droop so I can track it across the ownership of the vehicle. So thanks for those suggestions, Dylan and Jess. I've gotten a lot of great other comments and suggestions. Those are just two I wanted to include in the video. Now, speaking of the comment section, I try to read and respond to your comments every single day. I do miss them here and there, so please forgive me if you've given me a great suggestion. I'll probably find it later. That being said, your comments are really helping me keep this experiment on track and keeping me motivated to keep making these videos. So thank you for that. Please keep them coming. I want to make sure this experiment is not only just fulfilling the data I'd like to keep track of, but I want it to be the most applicable experiment to you guys. Whether you're considering buying a scooter, or you have one of these scooters, or you're just weighing some options here and there. So, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, make sure you subscribe to my channel, ring the notification bell, because you're not going to want to miss any video in this series. And until the next time I see you, I'll be living with a Tao Tao. Living with a Tao Tao.